The Targaryen Civil War was always going to be one of the most natural starting points for a spin-off of Game of Thrones. It included a lot of the elements that Game of Thrones viewers were already fans of, namely political intrigue, battling rivals, Targaryens, and dragons. However, its setting, characters, and era were all close enough to Game of Thrones that it wouldn't take much for the audience to orient themselves within the story either. And banking on a previous series for a spin-off success is always going to be a difficult line to walk. But at this point, House of the Dragon has tweaked Fire and Blood to connect it to Game of Thrones so much that it has lost what made that story, The Dance of the Dragons, so powerful and thematically relevant. Like everything in the history of Westeros, The Dance of the Dragons played a role in what ultimately unfolded within the main storyline of A Song of Ice and Fire. But reframing the dance, and the bulk of Targaryen history in Westeros that came before it, doesn't just radically change the narrative. It changes the meaning and subtext behind it as well. Introducing Aegon the Conqueror's hidden prophecy at the start of House of the Dragon already felt like a retcon that was designed to connect the show to Game of Thrones. It was there to make the audience more invested in this narrative and make it relevant to the story that viewers already cared about. But as this plot point has developed, and as House of the Dragon has tried to focus itself more around the idea of some mystical Targaryen destiny, rather than political conflicts, it has really undermined what George R.R. Martin was seemingly trying to say with The Dance of the Dragons to begin with. Targaryens believing that they are beyond mere mortals and are predestined for a grander fate isn't a new or strange concept in the world of Ice and Fire. So Viserys obsessively believing that he must do whatever it takes to create an heir, and then changing course when his belief kills his wife and seemingly any chance of a male successor, because Rhaenyra is now his only option left and therefore must fulfill his needs, isn't beyond credibility. Similarly, Rhaenyra believing that she has a larger destiny which makes the fight against the Greens, and all of the horrific losses that come with it, worthwhile, is understandable. Especially once Luke is already gone, succumbing to the sunk cost fallacy and assuming that her suffering is for the sake of something bigger is an almost rational conclusion to come to. But that also directly contradicts what the underlying themes of The Dance of the Dragons, and the entire history of House Targaryen, seems to be telling the audience. House Targaryen is undeniably extraordinary. They have access to unimaginable power, and after the doom of Valyria, they become the only bloodline left who has it. But that truth has become the foundation for their belief that they are legitimately something beyond human, closer to gods than men. House of the Dragon actually has Rhaenyra push back against this notion in the first episode. But then, with omens like the White Stag showing up for only her, and with visions like Helaena seeing the future Daenerys, the series seems to reverse course and imply that everything we're seeing is fated to happen as part of some broader Targaryen destiny, which seems to directly contradict what the tragedy of The Dance of the Dragons truly is. On a microcosmic scale, the Targaryens are simply following the blueprint that Valyria laid out for them. The blueprint that ultimately led to Valyria's destruction. They were in a position of power that was so great, no one could truly stand against them. However, they took that power for granted for so long that it eventually led to them destroying themselves. That mentality led to the combustion of an entire civilization. And it's a perspective that has come back to bite the Targaryens throughout their entire history in Westeros as well. Plenty of Targaryens before and after Viserys caused great harm to themselves and other people, because they believed that they could do what they wanted, or what they thought was right, without any consequence. But Viserys' belief that he could choose his successor and fly in the face of Westerosi law and tradition ultimately led to the demise of what gave House Targaryen its true power. And that's only the surface of the tragedy of The Dance of the Dragons. Rhaenyra is initially only affirmed as Viserys' heir before Aegon is born, because his presumed heir, Daemon, is another Targaryen who thinks the rules don't apply to him and he can do whatever he wants, which makes him incredibly dangerous in the eyes of most people in Westeros. The risk that was supposed to be avoided by making Rhaenyra the heir is reintroduced because Rhaenyra marries Daemon anyway, and her illegitimate sons following her in succession means that this is an issue that won't just go away once this generation of Targaryens is gone. And of course, all of this is by design. We're talking about a completely made-up history, so every element of this conflict is intentional and shouldn't be ignored. George R.R. Martin set the Dance of the Dragons up as a guaranteed Pyrrhic victory regardless of who the victor was. Because if the Greens or the Blacks could ever even dream of ensuring their safety, they'd have to eliminate the entire bloodline of their rivals. And one of the great tragedies of the entire Civil War is that, although the cost of the fight would be so severe that even winning would feel like losing, neither side could ever opt out of it. No matter what anyone did, having two rival claimants with relatively strong claims meant that it was always a question of kill or be killed. And it was all the more brutal because it was so ultimately pointless and unnecessary. There was no greater good at stake. They just nearly self-destructed and eliminated their true source of power because their belief that the rules don't apply to them finally caught up to them in the most violent way it could. Strangely, House of the Dragon seemed to acknowledge this at certain points during the series. But that has fallen by the wayside in favor of a narrative that at best treats this like a fated journey of House Targaryen, and at worst treats it like the Greens are doing everything in their power to obstruct Rhaenyra from her noble destiny. Perhaps the show is ultimately intending to subvert the idea of Rhaenyra as the chosen one, which at least is more in line with George R.R. Martin's writing style. But given how that went with Dany in Game of Thrones, that seems like a risky proposition. And if they're just playing it straight, that seems to fly in the face of many of the themes and philosophies that George R.R. Martin incorporates into his work. Because on a smaller scale, this undercuts what we see happening in the here and now. Yes, Luke was eaten, Jaehaerys was beheaded, and the realm is descending into war. But because Daenerys needs to exist, all of this is just a part of some grander plan. But more broadly, it conflicts with a lot of the ideas that are explored in the world of Ice and Fire overall. Misinterpretation of prophecy is a huge running theme within the books. Almost every prophecy we know of has been misunderstood by those who know of it. And oftentimes the cost of those mistaken beliefs has been absolutely catastrophic. So the notion that Viserys somehow got it right is implausible. But the implications of that are even more significant. George R.R. Martin consistently challenges the reader to consider the ethics of war and whether or not it can ever truly be justified. So reframing Aegon's conquest and the Dance of the Dragons as some kind of benevolent act in service of the Seven Kingdoms is an incredibly strange narrative choice. Firstly, the notion that Westeros could only unite against the threat of the White Walkers if Aegon the Conqueror overtook the continent by force is absurd. But the show doesn't really do anything to interrogate that idea beyond the surface level. For instance, it's fair to possibly imagine that Aegon or another Targaryen did have some prophetic vision of what was coming. And Aegon, Rhaenys, and Visenya came to the conclusion that the solution to this coming doom was to rule the kingdoms themselves. However, presenting it as a necessity for the greater good without any pushback within the narrative just fundamentally conflicts with what the books seem to be saying over and over again. The same goes for the Dance of the Dragons as well. Telegraphing Rhaenyra as the rightful heir and having even Daemon bend the knee to her, because Helaena gave him a that's-so-Raven vision of Daenerys in the future, is just a cop-out that erases the heart of the conflict that the entire show is about. It implies that everything that's happening is part of some necessary evil that will ultimately save the world. But if that's the case, why does anything that we're watching even matter? And of course, Rhaenyra is written as the protagonist of the series. But House of the Dragon has done a great deal to water down or mitigate the inherent conflict that exists with her claim to the Iron Throne. In context, it is absolutely true that Westeros would not have easily accepted a woman as their leader. Viserys was chosen to rule over Rhaenys specifically because male inheritance was prioritized, and men with much weaker claims than Aegon have inherited over women historically, both in Westeros overall and in the Targaryen family. So the Greens never had the option of just surrendering and living out their lives as happy princes and princesses. Fighting would have been a necessity regardless of who Viserys wanted on the throne, or what Alicent thought he said just before he finally died, even though House of the Dragon would make viewers think differently. Similarly, the show essentially neutered its largest looming threat in the form of Daemon. Rhaenyra only became Viserys' heir because Daemon was too dangerous to rule, and he wasn't willing to step out of line for the throne quietly. Getting rid of Laenor and marrying Rhaenyra was always largely driven by the fact that it was the easiest way for him to reinsert himself into the line of succession. And because this is a misogynistic society, he was well aware that if Rhaenyra became queen, then most of their followers would defer to him as the king anyway. But instead, Laenor's death was a fake-out, and Daemon ultimately decides to let Rhaenyra take the lead because the woman whose child he just had assassinated gave him a magical glimpse into the future. So he now also knows that Rhaenyra is the chosen one. At this point, while the premise of the show is the Dance of the Dragons, most of the conflict and stakes that exist within Fire and Blood have been written out. Most of the intentionally thought-provoking elements of the Targaryen Civil War have been retconned. And ultimately, why should anyone even care about what's unfolding here if this is all just designed to ensure Daenerys becomes who she becomes? Which we already know is going to happen. Ironically, a lot of this simplification seems to be driven by a desire to make Rhaenyra into the Daenerys of an earlier era. But these alterations have made the material a lot less intellectually challenging. Yes, this is a story about war with dragons, but that's not all that it was. And House of the Dragon seems to have lost sight of, or intentionally started overlooking, the complexities that made the Dance of the Dragons compelling in the first place. To be fair, a 4-season series was always a pretty tight timeline to tell this story through. And obviously, translating anything from book to screen is always going to require some changes. And it wouldn't be surprising if HBO pushed for many of these alterations, because Dany was arguably the most popular character in Game of Thrones. So they wanted to replicate that success with a new character and series. Regardless, changing the narrative to make Rhaenyra more heroic doesn't mean that all of the political and moral quandaries of the broader story need to be erased. People didn't like Game of Thrones because it was an action fantasy. The complexity of the characters and the political world that they inhabited is what made it into prestige television. And House of the Dragon seems to have left that by the wayside in favor of literal fire and blood. But what do you think? Has House of the Dragon lost track of what made the Dance of the Dragons a story worth telling? Leave your comments and opinions below, and if you're interested in more content like this, like and subscribe.